Since the Meiji Constitution in 1890, the military had indirect power over Japan's fiscal issues. This gave the military some control over politics. After the Meiji Constitution came the era of Taisho democracy. This era introduced Minpon Shugi, the two-party governing system. However, the peak in democracy and the failure of it also brought a rise in militarism in the 1930s. During the 1900s, the civilian government limited the military spending and power. This in turn caused many military officers to be retrenched, and to counter this, the compulsory military training in schools was introduced, and instilling the values of militarism to the youth. In the 1920s, the military was restricted financially and largely reduced from 21 divisions to 70. This, however, allowed them to increase efficiency and grow as a fighting force. Now let us look at the two most prominent political parties that arose during the Taisho democracy. Firstly, there was the old-timer Seiyukai and the new party Minseito, formed to counter the Seiyukai. The Minseito encouraged foreign relations and anti-war sentiments. Note that Katsura founded this party. His cabinet was later held hostage due to the Navy's refusal to supply a Navy minister. Various military officials such as Tanaka Giichi and Ito Hirobumi entered the political arena with holding high positions. This interest in politics was revived due to the resentment of military during the turn of the century up to the late 1920s. The two-party democratic system had failed as seen through corruption, ineffective policies to counter the Great Depression that led to widespread poverty and tax disparity. Towards the 1930s, the military began to share dual diplomacy with the civilian government. Dual diplomacy also meant that the party governments had significantly reduced authority. This was due to widespread support for the actions of the military as they were able to acquire territory and glorified Japan. This, together with the failure of civilian government, allowed the rise of militarism within Japan. The Kwantung Army is an example of the rise of militarism and the influence of the army in Japanese politics. Since inception in 1906, the Kwantung Army grew in size and influence. This army became so influential over the Japanese public that the civilian government failed to curb the army's ambition. In 1928, the army assassinated Manchurian ally and warlord Zhang Zuolin in hopes of Chinese retaliation, which they could use as an excuse to invade Manchuria. And again in 1931, for the same reason, the Japanese detonated a bomb along the tracks of South Manchurian Railway. After a few other influence, Japan created Manchukuo, the Manchuria under Japan. By 1932, the Kwantung Army was receiving popular support from the Japanese public, and the resentment for civilian government resulted in Japan leaving the League of Nations in 1932. Let me now talk about how exactly did the civilian party governments lose its popularity during the 1930s. During the 1930s, the civilian patriotic groups began to increase and they favored national polity and Japanese tradition. This meant that they believed in a governing system where the emperor held utmost power. These group of people also believed in Japan's expansionist ambitions and Pan-Asianism, the ideology whereby Asian nations unite to create a single identity to defeat the Western powers. The introduction of military training in schools during the 1920s caused a surge in ultra-nationalists in the 1930s. These new young army and navy officers, having been trained in army school, had more traditional ideals and strived for expansionism. They were thus more prone to overthrowing the currently corrupt civilian party governments and politicians. Party governance ended on May 15, 1932, when military personnel assassinated Prime Minister Inukai Toyoshi. They were seen as acts of patriotism. After the failures of party government, the next few prime ministers were military men. Army factions contended for power, leading to the rampage of assassination against all previous and current political figures on February 26, 1936. Japan's civilian leadership still resisted militaristic demands in hope of improving domestic issues, but failed. After Japan left the League of Nations in 1933, they began to isolate themselves from the West. Since the incident, militarism was prominent throughout Japan. The political influence of the military further increased in 1936 through the revival of the implementation that the army and navy ministers must be active generals and admirals. The termination of Washington and London naval treaties allowed rapid rearmament. Japan thus regarded USA and Britain as major threats to security and interest. Other phenomena that allowed the rise of militarism in the 1930s included the following 6 reasons. Firstly, Japan's aspiration for Western-style imperialism, which Japan worked towards through territorial acquisition. This act would require much military support. Secondly, Japan's security concerns, since it was rapidly expanding its territory, it was prone to attack from all neighboring countries such as Russia, Korea, Japan, and even Western powers. Thirdly, certain Japanese leaders believed in Japanese manifest destiny, where Japan's destiny was to free other Asian countries from Western powers. This school also gained popularity in the 1930s. Fourthly, provocation by Western powers led to resentment from imperialist Japan. This provided the need to expand military to attain equality and eliminate racism during international treaties and other conferences. Racist treatment can be especially observed when Japan's racial equality cause was rejected during Paris peace treaties. Fifth, Japan's economic status required resources from other countries. Through militarism, Japan ensured continuity of foreign trade through threat, even during the 1930s when the New York stock markets crashed. Lastly, Japan went through political infighting between party governments and the rise of ultra-nationalists. The civilian government was corrupt and failed to cooperate, thus the military stepped up and established near-complete control over governance during the 1930s. The rise of militarism was followed by an increased influence of the army in politics. This took place during the 1920s to 30s after seeing failure of civilian party government under Minpon Shugi. The influence of the army in politics was due to various military associated figures holding authority in the political arena. It can thus be concluded that the rise of militarism took place out of Japan's economic and security interests.